Welcome to IGN's History of Awesome, a year-by-year breakdown of some of the biggest influencers of modern pop culture. We're talking about the games, movies, shows, and toys that form the basis of our hobbies, loves, and obsessions. Basically stuff that IGN would have covered if we were around back then. Today details what some would say is the most important year for pop culture, 1977. Star Wars hit theaters and changed the landscape for Hollywood blockbusters. The Atari 2600 paved the way for a multi-billion-dollar industry, and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons laid down the rules for a tabletop classic. Of course, there's way more awesomeness this year, so let's jump right in.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining us for History of Awesome. I'm Steve Butts, I'm joined with Jim Vejvoda, Jared Petty, and Tal Blevins. We're here to talk about all the cool things that happened in 1977, but before we do that, I want to talk about why we picked 1977. Because there are a lot of cool things that happened prior to that year that we definitely agree are awesome. There was the publishing of The Lord of the Rings. There was 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Awesome, right?
There was Pong in arcades.
Star Trek.
Absolutely, but
My birth.
We're
All sorts of
we're picking 77 because that year was super crucial. It saw the release of three big entertainment properties, entertainment platforms really, that are at the heart of everything we do here at IGN every day. There was Star Wars and how it changed movie making and kind of transcended that medium. There was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and how it sort of set the model for fantasy games that we're still living with today. And then there was the birth of the Atari video computer system, which spawned tons of franchises and careers and companies that are vastly relevant to the stuff that we cover today.
Right.
So let's start in May. Star Wars comes out, and we have back here, it says A New Hope. It wasn't A New Hope back then, it just said Star Wars. The crawl came up.
Right, that was changed in '81 when they did a re-release, a theatrical release. Up to then, it was just Star Wars. And thinking about the fact that this came out in May, that means that January through April were inherently less awesome than the other two-thirds of the year that we're covering. And that's important because the build-up to this, people didn't realize how big a thing this was going to be. I mean, a lot of people around Lucas were telling him that this was going to be a disaster, and up until the point that it came out. So it's fantastic that it had such a quick flip around. And once it got into the hands of ordinary people, this became a cultural phenomenon like nothing else in American popular culture had ever been.
I mean, you could almost think of Star Wars as an indie film of its day, right? Because it had a lot of unknown actors in it. They really had a hard time getting a budget to really make it. You know, they didn't have big backing. Nobody was like super really excited about it. And like you said, it was a real challenge to get this thing out. But man, once it came out, what a game changer.
And all his director friends, with the exception of Steven Spielberg, thought this is a disaster. This is terrible.
Well, it's also, though, it's interesting because for him, he was coming off of, for Lucas, he's coming off of American Graffiti, which was, you know, this acclaimed little film, personal film, coming of age, you know, nostalgic, and then he goes right to a science fiction movie, which obviously is, you know, was one of his loves. But, you know, he had done THX 1138 before that as well. But this was, you know, and again, like, he only did Star Wars because he couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon. So if he had gotten the Flash Gordon rights, we might not, who knows what would have happened, you know?
Right, because instead he creates this fascinating kind of East meets West universe where all these Eastern elements that were permeating American popular culture around this period, you know, spiritualism and Eastern mysticism and martial arts meet classical, like Old West Western genre pieces and all mixes together with space guns and laser swords and galactic wizards, and somehow it all clicked just perfectly.
Well, and mythology, right? I mean, that was the thing. These were stories that everybody could relate to, and I think that's what really made it so successful at the time as well. This is something that, you know, you had a kind of real analog, dirty sci-fi world as opposed to these very stark, white, clean, like, you know, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Star Wars was a very lived-in world.
It was
Things
a very
were broken,
lived-in world.
things
It was
were dirty.
real.
Yeah, why throw something away when you can duct tape it back together? And that's the way life works, and it worked because of that.
The one thing that really touched me most about Star Wars, and the thing that I still love about it to this day, is something you touched on earlier. It's a science fiction fairy tale, right? There are you know, blasters and lasers, but they're also laser swords, right? And they're princesses, so it's this interesting melding of those two worlds. And really epitomizing the characters of Luke and Han, where Han's the realist, he's pragmatic, you know, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck. And Luke's this idealist who believes in more. And like, that's just such a universal kind of conflict, I think, that's central to who we are as people.
Right.
That's what really speaks to me.
And I think, not only the relationships with the people, but also, you know, even though it was in a galaxy far away a long time ago, right?
The fairy tale thing again, a long time ago.
It was something that was futuristic, but you could understand all the technologies there. Again, laser swords and little switches on Darth Vader and dials to change things, as opposed to being digital and being more abstract. It was something that actually was tangible.
Yeah, it was also, though, it definitely spoke to generational elements as well, and that there was a lot of World War II influence in there. I mean, with the galactic, and the Galactic Empire, I don't think it's any accident that they dress like Nazis.
What?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of there really was this incredible stew of stuff, right to like samurai stuff, everything. I mean, the fact that Hidden Fortress was a huge influence on there, and so yeah, I mean, to me it really is a perfect marriage of all these sort of disparate ideas that shouldn't work.
And you mentioned the dogfighting. It left this legacy too. I mean, you think about what's come out of it. You think about something like Industrial Light and Magic. When they get together and they start trying to make these effects.
We talked about too, right? Trying to be so scrappy with this, made his own like effects studio to be able to pull this off, right?
It's the same thing Peter Jackson did with Weta Workshop.
Right.
He realized there's nobody out there that can do what I want to do, that can get my vision on screen, and that's the birth of Industrial Light and Magic.
And ILM and just Lucasfilm in general have essentially given us the careers of people who are now dictating the popular culture, like David Fincher worked on Jedi, Joe Johnston, and the fact that even John Lasseter, and Pixar kind of came out of this whole movement. So it's an amazing legacy to just look at how one movie spawned everything that we kind of know about movie going and movie making.
Well, not just that, but that like ILM ended up being the studio house that drove effects through the 80s.
Yep.
I mean, all the CG stuff that we think of when we think of Young Sherlock Holmes or Wrath of Khan or The Abyss, like all that stuff was ILM. The thing they did in Star Wars before they got to this digital sort of workflow was motion control camera, right?
I love that.
So if you explain a little bit about what that is, like how does that work?
Basically, you used to have it was camera on a big arm, and you would have to time everything up so that the ship would move the model, because they actually used models back then, and everything would have to be timed just right, and there was like optical printing and blue screen and everything. And as a kid, one of the things that got me interested in filmmaking were the sort of making of Star Wars books that they would put out. And it was just fascinating, every element of it, from the sound to creature makeup to ship building to everything, set building, everything was fascinating.
I think that really goes into that tangibility of the world too, right? When you're using models and you're using things like, on the sound design, going out and actually hitting a guy wire on an antenna to make a laser sound instead of just, altering a waveform.
And screwing up the different sounds of animals.
And even the iconic title screen, that was analog. That wasn't digital at that point. They actually put that on a big light screen, and they filmed that going up.
And we were also accepting, though, too, of like matte boxes. Like when you would see it on video, I mean, nowadays it would be like, when Hobbit came out in 48 frames, people freaked out. Imagine back then when you go to the movie, you just see a big box of totally, showing that it's all fake. You're like, oh, I love this. This is fantastic.
Well, you mentioned sound, and I wouldn't want us to get past this point without mentioning John Williams and the symphonic score.
God,
right. There's the
Sci-fi
difference.
movies had been all electronic to that point.
Yeah, the difference that makes, it's not some guy sitting there with electronic instruments. Here he gets this boom, 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 full orchestras, and even when they go off to kind of the weird stuff,
He could have just gotten you, Jared.
But it was big and it was brash and it was bold, and there hadn't really been
like you.
Yeah, exactly. Hadn't been anything like it for a long time, and especially in science fiction. Not only that, but you had these themes that kind of fit the set pieces and the moments, right? These motifs,
It also again pulls on the things that everybody's familiar with, right? It's kind of a soundtrack that everybody kind of understands orchestras, where a lot of the sci-fi soundtracks at the time, you're using theremins, you're using moogs, like it's very
and it harkens back though too to like the old serials, the Flash Gordon stuff again, like the fact that even the way the movie is paced and the type of music that was used, it goes with the idea of every 10 minutes something has to happen, and there's this sort of melodramatic swelling music, and it really is just a huge big screen serial.
Well, these elements didn't come in until a little bit later. I mean, the other big revolution that Star Wars brought to us, to sort of this whole culture that we love, is the world of the movie that exists outside of the movie.
Right.
Yeah,
Toys, comic books, all these extra
I was going to
elements.
say, I think the thing that probably really mattered more to me at that age, because I was really young when Star Wars came out. I was probably 4 or 5. are the toys themselves. I mean, I had the little action figures. I had my suitcase or my briefcase with all the action figures. I still carry it into meetings today. Not really, but man, I wish I still had that.
You know what's funny? Because action figures up to that point were 8 or 12 inches, right? And you would clothe them in different outfits. It was a G.I. Joe, and you'd put a Batman outfit on them, or you'd put something else on them. This was the first time that this scale was really popularized. And what I really love about those old toys is just the total denial of the EU, right? There was a toy called Walrus Man because somebody was an extra in the back of the cantina scene. And like they hadn't really thought that far ahead, so they just said, look, let's put out a toy that's just called Snaggletooth, and it's this guy that we saw in the frame of
Right. I had a bunch of those, right? And I made my own little stories behind those guys because there was no backstory for those guys. And it was great, you know, go over and play with your friends, and all of a sudden you're creating these scenarios with these action figures, and you're expanding the universe of that.
Another thing that worked with those tiny action figures, because they cut the form factor down, there was room to make big vehicles to put them in.
Yes,
You could still fly around.
And the Millennium Falcon was so cool. The
Exactly.
whole top coming on.
Guys, we could do a whole episode about Star Wars. I love it. I could talk about that all day. But I do want to move on because there's lots of other cool stuff that happened. In June 10th, just a month later, the Apple II computer came out. Super expensive. Steve Wozniak. Tal, I know you actually got one of these, right?
That was my very first computer that I got. My mom was a school teacher. Got an Apple II for the home because they were a big discount for school teachers. And honestly, that's one of the things that influenced me to this day. I wouldn't be here at IGN if it weren't for computers because, and for the Apple specifically. My mom thought it would be a great educational tool. I kind of tricked her because I just used it for gaming, really. And you know, it was amazing.
It was built with gaming in mind. I mean, Wozniak designed the Apple II the way he did because he was trying to figure out a way to do breakout in software. So he gave it color, and he gave it a way to do sound. He gave it a way to put a controller interface in it. And suddenly you have this machine that's a perfect Trojan horse for getting games into your house. But it's also very easy to use compared to the computers that come up to that time, and relatively affordable.
It was really cool too. As a kid, you could literally take that case off super easily. It just clicked on the back. You take it off, and you're looking inside, and you're kind of understanding or getting a fascination with how computers are built.
I don't know if I was understanding microprocessors that well.
Well, like before that time, though, nobody would have ever thought like a computer in the house would have A, been useful, or B, would have been possible just because of the size of computers.
And it's also important because the Apple II led to, you know, other computers coming out around that same period of time that became sort of the Volkswagens of computers. The Apple was the Cadillac. But you had things like the Trash 80 that showed up in shopping malls, and ordinary families could really afford a Trash 80 that first couple of years, and they'd go home and we don't know what the computer's for, but I can put my recipes on.
You sound very derogatory when you're saying TRS 80.
I love the TRS 80.
So a couple of months later, August 20th and September 5th, NASA launched 2 probes, the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. The 2 launched before the 1, which is interesting, but the 1 eventually caught up and surpassed the 2. They were meant to explore the gas giants of our solar system. So they went by Jupiter, they went by Saturn.
So wait, was that the first instance of first?
It might have been the first. What's interesting though is 35 years later, just a few years ago, 2012, Voyager 1 left our solar system.
And these things are still going. I mean,
they're still operational.
They're still
will be for another
operational.
10 years.
We sent something we built to the edge of space.
Not only that, but we sent the Golden Record. Do you know that? The Golden Record is on Voyager 1. It's a record that NASA built that was inscribed with all these symbols and signs and actually had music inscribed on the record as well that they thought aliens would be able to access. Really, really interesting, sort of hopeful vision of First Contact, which actually comes back around later. We're going to talk about Close Encounters soon.
I actually, I do want to notate that just a couple of years later, it gave us our villain in our first Star Trek movie, Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I know, V'ger turned out to be Voyager.
The whole thing also, we're talking about PCs, the whole thing ran on about 40K of RAM, which is roughly what a fully equipped Apple II would have had around this time or a little after. So that got to the edge of space.
And it's been running for almost 40 years now, and it's outside of our solar system taking pictures of our sun. It's crazy.
Furthest thing that man has ever made.
It's the furthest man-made object from the Earth. A week later, the Atari VCS lands in living room.
Which is more important than Voyager.
Which is way more important. It was a hell of a lot cheaper, I'll tell you that. A lot of people know this as the Atari 2600. That wasn't its name until about 5 or 6 years later, right, Jared?
Right, yeah, it was a few years later before the 2600. That was its catalog number, and that's where that came from. But the Atari VCS Video Computer System was its original name. It was also sold as the Sears Video Arcade, which was an alternately branded but identical piece sold at Sears. That goes all the way back to a sporting goods relationship they had when they distributed the Pong dedicated home consoles a few years before.
The games were called something different too. Literally, the same game would be sold under a different title.
Right,
Sears.
like Air Sea Battle was sold as Target Fun, but it was the same game. Even different pack-ins. Actually, Air Sea Battle was the pack-in for the Sears one. Combat was the pack-in.
I think I remember these in like
VCS.
the Sears catalog back in the day, where you would actually go to Sears.
absolutely.
They would have the catalog.
That
and
was
of
the
course,
thing
every
they did
kid
that,
would
right?
just jump to the
Because
thing.
at Christmas time, you would open up
Yeah.
the catalog and you would circle what you want. I remember
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
very vividly. And the Atari 2600 was always circled in multiple reds, right?
There's still things in that catalog I never got.
So importantly, though, this thing, it was designed to be manufactured cheaply. They wanted to make it affordable, and so it was one of the most Baroque and strange Frankensteinian designs ever.
It had the wood grain and everything.
Yeah, on the outside, but even inside, it was designed to be a machine that software engineers were going to do all kinds of strange things, and they far surpassed the expectations of the people that designed the hardware, which is why the things had such amazing longevity.
Well, not just that, but video game systems up to that point were designed to run a single game.
Right.
And the big advantage that the Atari 2600 or VCS at the time had was that it leveraged the ROM technology that the Fairchild had pioneered previously. So now you could buy different games and plug them into this platform.
Yeah.
Like carts were born.
Exactly.
Carts.
So for me, my best friend had a Pong machine, a Magnavox Pong machine, and we would go over there and play that, and that was a lot of fun. And then another friend of mine had an Odyssey where you actually had the overlays for the TV, right? And you would play games on that. But then when the Atari came out, you were like, oh man, you can have 40 different experiences just by flicking a little switch on the Atari. You can pop in a cartridge and you can be playing, anything from a combat like a military game to a space game to a circus game.
Yeah,
It's funny, when you bought it, you got that second controller. Like, you don't get that with the PS4 or some of the other consoles.
When you
paddles.
bought a system back then, you got stuff. You got a console, you got 2 joysticks, you got 2 paddle controllers, alternate controllers with it. So it came with 4 controllers and a game, and this was for about $200, which is pretty amazing. 3 notable games.
$200.77.
Yeah, no, granted, that's true. Inflation has had its
Well, yeah, let's
effect,
talk
but-
about the launch lineup. Because
Yeah.
people talk about launch lineups today as if there's some sort of idealistic period when all these great games came out on the day that the system was
there
released. That wasn't the case with the VCS.
Absolutely. A lot of the VCS original games were really bad, but there were 3 good ones. Combat, which is kind of the first deathmatch game.
was the pack-in.
Right, that's the pack-in, and that's tank versus tank or plane versus plane. Great 2-player versus game, lots of variations. The second one is Air Sea Battle, sometimes called Target Fun, which is a really nice kind of 1 or 2-player shooting gallery game with some versus modes. And the third one, Video Olympics, which is a whole bunch of Pong variants that let you use those paddle controllers. Those 3 games all 3 of them I played fairly recently. All 3 of them are still fun.
Fantastic.
Do they
But
still
games
have those
like,
god-awful
later
sound
on-
effects?
They still do, but I like those sound effects.
Later on, though, with games like Warlords and Keystone Capers and
Adventure. We're
and
going to be talking about
Adventure.
a lot of these games coming up soon. I do want to talk about the credits controversy, though, because at the time, Atari didn't want people putting their names in the credits, and that alienated and discouraged a lot of early designers who then left and formed Activision, for example.
Activision and Imagic, and they came out and formed these third-party companies and created a whole new industry. And that all happens a little later on, but it's an important part of, the company started thinking of these as products. The people creating them started thinking of them as creations or art.
Yeah.
And that tension still exists in our industry today. But they wanted credit for these things they were inventing.
And we'll talk about Warren Robinette and Adventure in a little while. But I want to talk about what happened next in November, the Incredible Hulk TV pilot. Now, the series debuts in 1978. But in November of that year, they put, CBS did, I believe, on TV, the pilot movie. And Universal had been trying for a long time to get superheroes on TV. And this idea that we have today of, Daredevil and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and this sort of shared Marvel universe, it seemed like there were some hints that might be happening. But it ended up like the Hulk was the only thing in that show, right?
Yeah, well, it wasn't until the 1980s when they did the TV movies and basically had Thor and Daredevil show up there. But the Hulk was predated by Spider-Man on television.
He was in the Electric Company, had some segments, and then there was also a live action.
And then there was the
pilot
live
as well.
action. There was actually a 1-season show of that. But the Hulk was really the one that found that longer mainstream success. I think it ended up being on the air like 5 years.
Yep.
And it had a long syndication life after that, which is where I caught it as a kid. I watched it when it was in syndication and loved it. I love that show so much. I remember that I went to Sunday school when I was like 3 years old, and I colored in Jesus green on my Sunday school thing. And my teacher asked me
like
why,
Jesus
and I
when he's
said,
angry.
what I said was, he's strong like the credible Hulk. And I think we still have my Hulk Jesus someplace. But,
That's
He's going to be Phase 4 in the MCU.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in kindergarten at the time, and I remember after the premiere of The Incredible Hulk, obviously watched it, was super excited about it as a kid. Dad was driving me to school. And if you remember in the pilot, the first time that Bill Bixby turns into the Incredible Hulk, it's this horrible downpour. He's driving on this like mountain road, pouring down, and he blows a tire, right? He has to get out, he's changing the tire, he hits his hand with a tire iron, and all of a sudden that made him so mad, just that little thing, by the way, made him so mad that he turns into the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
And on the way to school, we got a flat tire, and I was so afraid that my dad was going to turn into the Incredible Hulk. I swear.
Like, this is just how grown-ups work.
Yeah, it was traumatizing.
Well, one interesting fact I found out when we were sort of researching the topics for this show is that the producer for The Incredible Hulk was also the guy who had done $6 Million Man and spun off The Bionic Woman as sort of a secondary series. And Marvel got word that he had maybe been considering doing that for Hulk, creating a female version for the Hulk. And so to kind of steal a march on him, they rushed through into production She-Hulk because they wanted to say that they owned the rights to that character because they were the ones who originated.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it,
That
though?
is really neat.
It's interesting, like how these things happen. Like She-Hulk is the result of a business fear.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's also I think one of the things that made the Hulk TV series a mainstream success was the fact that it kind of played on an already hit show, The Fugitive, which in and of itself was based on a true story, but it's also very much like Les Miserables, you know?
Yeah, because in the comics, General Ross is the guy chasing the Hulk. In the TV show, it's some reporter.
Jack McGee.
But he's based on
Those
Inspector,
damn reporters.
Inspector Javert from Les Mis, intentionally.
Also, that theme song.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It had this
That
wonderful
theme song is still in my head to this
That
day.
melancholy to it. You know?
It's basically encapsulates depression and loneliness,
Right.
You know, but that TV series has had a longer influence, I think, on the live action presentation of Hulk than even possibly than the comics, maybe, because when they get around to doing the Incredible Hulk movie, they definitely went more of the TV show route, make him a fugitive.
That loner, right? He can't be around people because he kind of destroys their
Even
lives.
Mark Ruffalo at the beginning of Avengers, it's like that.
So a couple of weeks later, after you saw the Incredible Hulk TV pilot, you could go to theaters and you could see this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Spielberg's just off the success of Jaws. Can you imagine a better back-to-back kind of pairing
No,
of
I
movies
can't.
that you make?
I thought my
and this
dad
is
was
back when Spielberg
going to turn into a mountain of mashed potatoes.
Right. This is back when Spielberg, he was a director, right? Like he has a very different sort of role now and a very different sort of public perception, but he was a movie maker behind the camera here, and I love the hopeful vision that this has for First Contact.
Absolutely. It's one of the most beautifully directed of all his movies. Shot after shot after shot, just iconic and wonderful. From the people all pointing at the sky at once to the light bathing through the door. But yeah, you mentioned it's a friendly First Contact. There are scary moments throughout this
People
movie.
do get kidnapped. Let's not
Yeah.
gloss over that.
But there's like
And
in
that
the
kid is
middle,
freaky.
Yeah, there's a lot of scary moments. You'd be like, oh, and this is right off of Jaws. And you're like, oh my, what's going to happen? And then just when you think it's getting too frightening, there'll be a little whimsical, little tiny aliens like, oh, he's happy.
Well, I think it's really amazing, too, that the mindset of the time, right? Voyager as well was really this hopeful way to look at contacting alien life. And then we have this film that had obviously been in production for a long time, but it just kind of goes to that at the time, trying the melding of cultures and really thinking as globally and universally, right?
I also,
really reflection.
One little note on this I would add is that, Francois Truffaut, one of the founders of the French New Wave, is in the movie as an actor playing the scientist guy in the main thing. And it's amazing that you have this sort of quintessential young Hollywood director making this great American Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
And you've got one of the founders of the French New Wave in a leading role. It's just...
This movie is also responsible for an entire generation of children making little mountains out of mashed potatoes. Which is what I did as a kid after I watched it.
So I don't want to neglect the role that Douglas Turnbull played in this movie as well, because he had turned down Star Wars. He's the effects supervisor for this movie. He had actually said, I don't want to work on Star Wars, did this instead. I actually think turned in an amazing performance as sort of the effects director here. Went on to work on Blade Runner, Star Trek, the motion picture. But I love this ship right here. I mean, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful image. And the weightlessness of Richard Dreyfuss and the cab of his truck. Like, there's just so many great, iconic special effects moments for me.
And also everything, the fact that so much of it, again, practical, models, that would not have the impact, the resonance, if it was digital.
And a wonderful sense of color throughout this movie. So much use of light and color in brilliant ways.
Somebody who did work on both movies was John Williams, though.
Yeah.
So
Again,
77, the year of John Williams.
John Williams.
I mean, both Williams and Spielberg, think about that swath of time there, and that this is like your golden period. You know, it's like, you know, Hitchcock from basically the late 40s, early 50s through like, you know, the mid 60s. Like that was your time, you know?
Absolutely. And also, this is notable because Spielberg wanted to do a different cut of the movie very shortly after it was released. And the studio said, we'll do it, but only if you show the inside of the spaceship. And he took that as a compromise and said he regretted it afterwards. But it began sort of, or maybe popularized, this notion of famous directors being unhappy with the works that they made. There's another famous movie that we already talked about where that's sort of a controversial idea. But yeah, it's super interesting. Finally, in December of '77, there's an ad in Dragon magazine for the Monster Manual. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is actually out on the scene. I want to mention, you know, D&D of course started in 1974 with Dave Arneson, who, in my opinion, doesn't get nearly enough credit, and Gary Gygax. So not to take anything away from him, but D&D was, you know, the intersection of theater games and war games, you know, storytelling type games and tactical battle games. And Dave Arneson introduced the concept of dungeon crawls and dungeon masters and things like that. But with AD&D, things went to this whole other level.
They kind of turned it up to 11. I mean, for races and classes get separated out so that now you can choose a race and a class instead of being locked into one. You have many more attributes, many more character classes available. It's just moving from a very kind of tiny, focused abstract into, hey, I really can be just about anybody I want to be in this world. There's so many options available, and you take those and you analog those abilities you have into numbers, and really that becomes important later on, as this is going to make a transference into video games in a few years that's vital. This is the beginning of taking something you want to be, turning it into a number, and then gradually working that into a computer, into what becomes
not just that concept, but the very like labels we use, right? Like paladins and druids are part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They're part of the supplements that Dave Arneson wrote. And when you play World of Warcraft and you want to be a druid, you can thank Dave Arneson for coming up with that.
That's the archetype.
But also, it expanded just sort of geek culture in a way, and it made it something that the outside world really took up and took notice of, and it became, you know, it's still to this day, it's kind of like a shorthand for, you know, whether you're referring to somebody as you know, a fanboy or a geek or whatever, but it's got a sort of, it broadened the horizons, and I feel like almost helped create, kind of like Star Trek and Star Wars did, but a sense of community amongst fans too. Like, hey, there's somebody else who's into this stuff, and
it's like a secret language.
Like it really
an
did
alignment
open it
tongue,
up.
you might say.
You'll also, I mean, you know, it's to the point where like it's so ubiquitous, it's easy to just discount its influence. But things like ability scores, right?
Exactly.
Like having an 18 in strength or being under, you know, represented in another ability score, like that's D&D. This is the system that I think popularized that idea, and it's virtually it's so many places today that it's like a fish being wet. You don't
It
even
literally
notice it.
gamified fantasy, and you know, after that, it went into sci-fi and it went into horror games, and we would not probably have the video game industry today without those original tabletops.
In a year when fantasy and science fiction ruled popular culture, this gave you and your friends a way to dive into your own imaginary universe and create your own stories and tell them in a new and exciting way.
So it was always great for me as a kid. I had my best friend had 3 brothers, and they actually had a big basement, and we always had a built-in group to be able to play AD&D, you know, go over there, and we would create our own stories, and we had our books of characters, because we would just make characters because it was fun to make a character, even without the story, right? So it was just a great learning and imaginative experience.
It's interesting you mentioned alignment tongues. That's another thing that we got out of AD&D was, you know, we play Mass Effect and you make the Paragon Renegade choice. That was something that D&D, you know, popularized. That was a format that they created.
And you end up with that complex alignment grid in AD&D that lets you think, you know, being good and evil is not the same as being lawful and chaotic. Now we can, you know, hey, there are good people that don't like order, and there are bad people that don't necessarily enjoy chaos. And that's another thing.
Darth Vader is the great example, right? Like very authoritarian, but also doesn't really care if he happens to run over you to get what he wants. Let's talk specifically about the Monster Manual. What I really loved about the Monster Manual, the thing that spoke to me the same way that sort of science meets faith / mysticism in Star Wars, was this amazing combination of math and myth, right? Like numbers and stats and real crunchy stuff, but also with centaurs and pegasuses and dwarves and things like that.
It's basically like it's like when you get like sports cards with player stats, but meets a bestiary from like the Middle Ages.
Exactly.
It's like, how many games does that dragon kind of thing?
Absolutely,
That iconic art as well, too. I just remember as a kid going into the bookstore and seeing those, and as bad as some of the art looks today, just being amazed by it, seeing that unicorn with the beard, or seeing that big red dragon flying over, you know, or seeing that owlbear just from a side profile.
Once again, inspiring an entire generation of drawings on Trapper Keeper.
Yeah, exactly.
That art, that art was bad, most of it, but it's bad in a wonderfully, lovingly rendered way.
And the graph paper industry was probably saved by.
You mentioned going into bookstores, and that's really interesting. I want to dig into that a little bit, because we take for granted today that there are gaming stores and hobby shops, and in San Francisco there are quite a few, and sort of in the greater Bay Area.
Or that you can buy everything online.
Or that you can buy everything. But you had to go to a boutique store to actually find that monster manual. And I remember seeing it in Chapel Hill when my dad was on a business trip, and I went with him. And I saw this, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like I've been looking for this book a long time, and here it finally is.
It used to have to go to like model shops. Like,
Yeah,
I don't want
exactly.
to train. I don't want to get some World War II plane.
Can you imagine like trying to find a D12 in 1977? Like, it was not the easiest thing in the world. You had to order it by mail.
You had to whittle your own.
Turn to the back of your
Whittle your own.
magazine, send real money in a real envelope to an address, and wait 6 weeks, and then your die would come in the mail.
So I don't want to discount. 77 also saw the release of Traveller, which I think is hugely influential in the RPG community. But D&D specifically, went on to dominate RPGs throughout the 80s, contributed to a massive explosion in RPGs. Tons of games that I know we've all played and enjoyed quite a bit.
AD&D is the reason your grandmother is afraid of demons and dragons, but it's also
My grandmother actually played D&D with me once.
That's awesome.
I got her to be a cleric, and I pushed that sort of like religious angle just to get some buy-in from her.
She went to confession right after.
Right.
Sure, yeah.
I grew up in the South. We didn't have a lot of Catholics where I lived. You and I are from different parts of the country. Yeah. So in closing, you know, I want to ask, which of these things that we've talked about today do you feel like sort of means the most to you individually? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Definitely Star Wars. I mean, I still have a real soft spot for, you know, Incredible Hulk, just for personal reasons. I remember watching it with my dad and kind of curling up like I'm 4 or 5 years old, and sort of curling up my head on his stomach or on his armpit or something as he's kicking back watching TV.
It's like the most adorable.
You know, but Star Wars for me, I mean, it's a cliche now, but it changed my life. It changed everyone's life. Like, I wouldn't probably have been interested in movie making or anything like that if it wasn't for Star Wars. So whatever hang-ups I may have developed later on with Lucas and everything, dude, the guy changed everyone's lives.
Yeah.
And for the better.
Jared, what about you?
Star Wars for me as well. As influential as these other things were, by the time I was 4 years old, I could recite the script for New Hope from beginning to end. My parents would have me do it for people, just talk any line at any time.
Hey, do you have 2 hours? Or
Exactly. It was kind of like that. Yeah.
That's how I learned the word suicide from Star Wars, not to be a downer, but one night my mom comes in, she's like, yeah, dinner's ready. I'm like, dinner, more like suicide. And my father's like, don't say that. And I'm like, what? What does that mean? So that's, thank you, Han Solo, for getting me in trouble.
It was on cable by the time I was a kid every day. I think we had HBO or something. But yeah, I mean, I bought a 4-colored pen so that I could have a red and green ink to draw authentic Rebel versus Imperial lasers on my space battles in my little notebook.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Star Wars opened my eyes to the possibility that we lived in a world of good versus evil and that you had to choose a side. And I've kind of blithely looked at life very naively ever since then that way. That ultimately what we do is either going to help people or hurt people. Star Wars kind of instilled that in me, and it's been foundational. And the fact that all that's built in a pop space fantasy thing, I'd like to be embarrassed by it, but I actually still think it's true, so I'm not.
I think this is a safe place.
Yeah, Star Wars. Star Wars.
What about you, Tal?
Mine would be gaming platforms, the Apple and the Atari, because both of them were very important to me at a young age. I had both platforms. I even, you know, for the Atari, I even remember we were having some school drive. I think we were selling pizzas around, and I went around, and whoever sold the most got the most tickets in a lottery to win an Atari. That was the big prize that year. Yeah. And I remember going door to door and hawking those pizzas to people, man, being a little because I wanted that Atari so badly. And lo and behold, I ended up winning it at the very end and was just super excited. My mom was pissed off because she had bought me one already for Christmas, so she had to return it. So I was getting one regardless. But yeah, I mean, these gaming platforms, I would not be where I am here today at IGN without having been, you know, exposed to gaming and being so fascinated at a very young age. Just that ability to turn on a monitor or turn on a TV and instead of just passively sit there, affect what's going on to the screen was amazing to me at a young age, and still is to this day.
What if
video
it had
games are still magic?
A
right?
different effect, and you open up like a chain of pizza shops. You know, like maybe your life
You
was
had to
supposed to
sell a
go
bunch of
one way.
Ataris to win pizza.
Yeah. Steve, I'm curious. What about you?
For me, it would. I mean, I'm with you guys. It's very hard to pick. For me, it would have to be Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, just the storytelling, the social element of sort of interacting with your friends and gaming and sharing the sort of experience where you're building a narrative together. But then it's also anchored in dice, and probability, and numbers and math. Like that to me, that did more, I think, to change me than just about anything else on that list.
Here's what I love too. All these things, right? Pretty counterculture at the time, right? Sure. Not really in mainstream. I love where we are today that these are just mainstream things. Star Wars is obviously very mainstream with the new movie coming out. Obviously computers and gaming platforms, super mainstream. Tabletop gaming, I mean still fantasy at least, like we see with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the popularity of those. Like those have become mainstream. Comic book heroes are mainstream.
You mentioned, you said,
It's
you know, you wouldn't be
wonderful.
here at IGN if it weren't for those two, the Apple and the Atari platforms. I don't think any of us would be here if it weren't for several other things on this list. But more importantly, I don't know that there would be an IGN today if it wasn't 1977.
Yeah.
And that to me is both
Thank
a terrifying
you,
and a very
1977.
comforting
No,
prospect.
IGN kind of exists at the convergent trajectory that
Yeah.
began with these things in '77. D&D, Star Wars, and
Voyager.
video games would all kind of move together closer and closer as the years passed and began to overlap. And we sort of exist where those things meet now.
I got to tell you, I kind of want to play Knights of the Old Republic now.
Oh,
Because I think that game brings all three of these big properties together in such a great way. Guys, thank you so much. I could do this all day, but we obviously want to move on to some of the other topics we have. So thank you again. I do want to say there are plenty of things in '77 that I love, that I know you guys love, that we weren't able to get to. The Rankin Bass Hobbit adaptation. '77 was the first appearance of Judge Dredd and the first appearance of Sabretooth. There was Suspiria, the Italian horror movie. Stephen King published The Shining. Christopher Tolkien published The Silmarillion. There was Space Wars, the old Vector game. So tons of amazing things in 1977. We want to know what's your favorite. So please tweet using the hashtag HistoryOfAwesome, and definitely let us know in the comments below which of the things that came out in '77 that you felt most affected you as a gamer or just a fan of popular culture. And guys, we got 1978 coming up right after this. We're going to be talking about Superman the movie. We're going to be talking about Space Invaders. We're going to be talking about Dawn of the Dead. So lots of great stuff coming. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys again.
Thank you.